Right, so there's the second sound test for the evening, and we'll carry on with chapter 20, wasn't it? So Dirac has, in the summer of 1935, left Princeton, written to his wife on the journey to Japan by boat, and 6 weeks later arrived in Moscow. Where he is now staying with his good friend Kapitsa in a Dachau, 35 miles south of Moscow. The two friends relaxed together for almost 3 weeks. Kapitsa's abject morale had not improved when he heard that the Soviet authorities had, for unknown reasons, sent Dismas Ivanenko into exile. It was a familiar story, though no one dared to question Stalin's policy in public. Kapitsa was considering giving up physics and changing the subject of his research to physiology so that he could work with Russia's most senior scientist, the elderly but still active Ivan Pavlov. With the modest compass of Dirac's verbal skills, he tried to lift Kapitsa's spirits, and in return, Kapitsa, evidently knowing nothing of Dirac's friendship with Mansi, tried to fix him up with a young girl they met, a good-looking, English-speaking language student. Dirac did not respond. During his stay, he met the Trinity College physiologist Edgar Adrian and other British colleagues asked by Rutherford to assess Kapitsa's situation and his psychological state. The Soviet government supported this visit, presumably to demonstrate their flexibility. But by the time Adrian and his colleagues met with Kapitsa, the die was cast. Kapitsa had been forbidden to return to Cambridge, and it remained only to secure the best terms for him to continue to work in his new institute. When Dirac left Moscow at the beginning of September, he knew that he had lost his first diplomatic battle. He would have to become accustomed to living in Cambridge without the man he thought was his without the man he thought of as his closest friend. The final stage of the trip was an antidote to his disappointment. He was to visit Mansi in Budapest. She was living with her children in an apartment in what had been Archduke Frederick's house, a short stroll from her parents' sumptuous residence opposite Count Bethany Park. I didn't say that correctly. Bethany Park. This was a world of plenty. Fine food, exquisitely cut clothes, attentive servants, and private concerns in the living room. Dirac's modest origins in Bishopston, Bristol, of course. Dirac's modest origins in Bishopston were part of another world. Mansi took her material comforts for granted, but she was unhappy and longed to get away from her parents, who must have been taken aback by the arrival on their doorstep of an unkempt Englishman who knew hardly a word of Hungarian. They knew next to nothing about him, and surely cannot have been and surely cannot have expected that their feisty, outspoken daughter would choose such a diffident man. But they liked him, and they could see that Mansi and Dirac clicked during their 9 days together, driving around the city in her new car, sightseeing and soaking in the famous indoor public baths. When he returned to Cambridge, he wrote to Mansi, "I felt very sad when leaving you, and I still feel that I miss you very much, and I do not understand why this should be, as I do not usually miss people when I leave them. I expect you spoil me too much when I am with you." Mansi was making progress, but 3 weeks later her heart sank when she read the final entry in Dirac's latest table of unanswered questions to her query. "Do you miss me a little?" He responded, "Sometimes." When Dirac returned to England in the early autumn of 1935, the country was still disfigured by unemployment and worried by Hitler's aggressive rearmament, Mussolini's sabre-rattling in East Africa, and Japan's occupation of Manchuria. "I would like to kill the politicians of Middle Europe," Mansi fumed. Dirac was soon back in his Cambridge routine, but the thrill had gone. Although he had not given up on quantum electrodynamics, he seemed to be getting nowhere. Dirac thought a revolution was needed, and probably wondered whether he, now 33 years old, might not be too old to be one of its leaders. Rutherford had negotiated a deal that involved moving almost every item of Kapitsa's equipment to the Institute for Physical Problems, enabling him to resume all his experiments there. Anna had made Dirac a guardian of the Kapitsa's sons, and he took on his duties seriously, taking the boys out at weekends for rides in his crumbling car, and organising his first fireworks display for them on the 5th of November. These were good times for Dirac, but he was preparing for yet more loneliness. The Blacketts had left for London, Chadwick for Liverpool, Walton for Dublin, and now the Kapitskas were about to depart for good. Dirac was not the self-sufficient eremite that many people might have believed him to be. He needed new companionship, and he knew it. Mansi was eager to oblige. But he was wary of her forwardness, and he showed when she telephoned him one night late in November as he was preparing to go to bed. She thought he would be delighted to receive an unexpected call from her, but he was angry and shaken. The college telephone system was arranged so that the porters heard their stilted conversation, as he explained to her in a brusque note. Surely it was sufficient to communicate only by letter, he wrote, with all the warmth of a tax inspector. She swiftly replied, making clear what she thought of his secretiveness, that he was being ridiculous. Incidents like that rattled him. Could he live with someone who had so little sympathy for his need for privacy? He would have had no wish to be party to a disastrous marriage like his parents, which he had seen in all its unpleasantness 2 months before during another rain-soaked visit to Bristol. Charles and Flo were living out their marriage contract in an unwinnable endgame of squabbles and recriminations. Divorce was out of the question for the born-again Catholic Charles, but when he read his copy of George Bernard Shaw's Getting Married, he may well have sympathised with the author's recommendation. Make divorce as easy, as cheap, and as private as marriage. Flo would have welcomed a divorce, but the shame would have been too much for her. So they both remained unhappily shackled to each other, with nothing to look forward to except more arguments. Flo told her son that her pleasures were limited to taking long walks on the downs, sitting alone in the parks, and attending meetings of the new Bristol Ship Lovers Society. "I have made an awful mess of my life somehow," she wrote, adding that she blamed herself. "We sow what we sow, we reap." Dirac's mother appears to have had no more than a passing interest in Dirac's work, but his father struggled hard to understand it. Charles looked through the journals in the library, searching for readable accounts on quantum theory, hoping to absorb some of their content by writing out paragraphs of difficult technical prose verbatim. He kept a record of his findings in a small red notebook, on whose front cover he had written a 2-inch high letter P. The desultory references and notes inside are heart-rending records of a keen but confused amateur, unable to make any headway in a subject he longed to understand. Charles had written in his rheumatic hand some of the most complimentary comments about his son, highlighting some of the most generous ones. Dirac stands out amongst his contemporaries in this field for his originality. Apart from a summary of one of Crowther's articles on new particles, Charles had not tracked down any of the lively and accessible accounts of quantum mechanics by Eddington or any of the accomplished popularizers. It seems that his son was giving him no help at all. With Bristol's long tradition of adult education, it was easy for the city's citizens to find out about new science. Arnold Tyndall, who gave Dirac his first induction to quantum theory, was a popular performer at the night classes on science organised by the university. During one of his courses, a male student caught the eye of the genial Tyndall. Much older than the other students, he always sat at the front, taking careful notes. And at the end of the final lecture, he shuffled up to Tyndall to thank him. "I'm glad to have heard all this. My son does physics, but he never tells me anything about it." The student was Charles Dirac. In the early summer of 1935, Betty had finished her French course and had come bottom of her class, taking a third-class honours degree, as Felix had done. She wanted to be a secretary and get out of Bristol as quickly as she could. Charles was now open to his relationship. Charles was now open about his relationship with Mrs. Fisher, Flo told Dirac. "I wish he would go and live with her, as always seeing them about together. And tell me, he has always had someone, ever since I've been married. Betty says it is a French." Dirac's mother, preparing to go on another Mediterranean cruise alone, sensed that her daughter was growing away from her. In a few weeks she would temporarily move to London, not leaving her mother a forwarding address. But first Betty went on an August vacation with her father, keeping their destination secret. They were travelling with a group of Catholic priests on a pilgrimage to Lourdes in the French Pyrenees, where Charles May tried to rid himself of his ailments. Where Charles May, to try to rid himself of his ailments, have bathed in its reputedly miraculous waters. He knew that his daughter would pray for him, but his wife and son were, at best, indifferent to his fate. Dirac would probably have been happiest if, like Einstein, he had never supervised a graduate student. It was not until the 1935-6 academic year that Dirac officially became a research supervisor, taking on two students that Born had left behind when he moved to Edinburgh to take up a professorship. Dirac had almost none of the skills that he had seen in Fowler: the ability to set problems pitched at the right level for his students, to motivate them in lean times, and to support them at the early stages of their career. Dirac believed his only obligation was to point his students towards an interesting theoretical concept, and then to look over any work they produced in consequence. It was up to the student to take almost all of the initiative. Only the cleverest and most independent-minded students could flourish under such a regime, as the Cambridge authorities knew. Dirac knew it too, and showed no interest in recruiting apprentices. But several of the finest young minds sought out his guidance, including the Indian mathematician Harish Chandra and the Pakistani theoretician Abdus Salam, both part of a pattern. The great majority of Dirac's successful students were foreign. Dirac encouraged his students to keep abreast of the latest publications in theoretical physics, and also to keep an eye on the experimenters' latest findings. But his faith in the veracity of new experimental results was badly shaken by an incident that began in the autumn of 1935. Dirac had heard that the Chicago experimenter Robert Shankland had found evidence that sometimes energy is not conserved, contrary to one of the fundamentals of science. When photons are scattered by other particles, he found that the particle's total energy before the collision is not the same as it is afterwards. Setting aside his preference to be led by mathematics rather than experiment, Dirac smelt an impending revolution, and in December wrote to Tam, spelling out the consequences of Shankland's findings. First, the neutrino would be no longer needed, as Pauli had based his entire argument for its existence on the energy conservation law. Second, and more important, Shankland's experiment involved light. His results might be a hint that energy is not conserved whenever particles collide at speeds close to the speed of light. If so, Dirac pointed out, it would be reasonable to retain the basic theory of quantum mechanics, which applies to comparatively slow-moving particles, through the relativistic extensions of the theory, such as quantum electrodynamics, might have to be abandoned. A few days later, at the Kapitsa Club, still meeting despite its founder's absence, Dirac gave a talk on the implications of Shankland's results. To most physicists, the experiments looked unreliable, but it seemed wise to wait for the results to be checked, independently. But Dirac could not wait, and in January 1936, he set out the implications of Shankland's results in a short, equationless article in the journal Nature, addressing his comments to this entire scientific community. If Shankland was right, Dirac said, quantum electrodynamics would have to be abandoned, adding, most physicists will be very glad to see the end of it. Coming from one of the discoverers of relativistic quantum mechanics and field theory, these were striking words. Heisenberg privately dismissed Dirac's thoughts as nonsense. Einstein did not conceal his glee. I am very happy that one of the real experts now argues for the abandonment of the awful quantum electrodynamics. Schrödinger, disillusioned with the conventional interpretation of quantum theory, was pleased that Dirac had apparently joined the malcontents, and Bohr, who in 1924 had been among the first to suggest that energy might not be conserved in every atomic process, was publicly less critical, though he took Shankland's results with a pinch of salt. Experimenters, including Blackett in London, downed tools, changed their plans, and began programs of experiments to investigate Shankland's claims. A few months later, however, it became clear that he had been wrong, and that energy was indeed conserved. The false alarm made a deep impression on Dirac. A year later he wrote ruefully to Blackett, "After Shankland, I feel very sceptical of all unexpected experimental results. I think one should wait a year or so to see that further experiments do not contradict the previous results before getting worried about them." Dirac's inclination to believe exciting new observations had been irreversibly undermined.